Hi, my name is Jon Goodman, and we are talking about escalation clauses today. So the first question is, what the heck is an escalation clause in a real estate transaction? An escalation clause is essentially a clause that a buyer would use who wants to compete to buy the property, but the buyer wants to win the competition by as little as possible. So an escalation clause, and I'm not a fan of escalation clauses. I'm not dictating a clause that you should actually use, but just for purposes of explaining what an escalation clause is, an escalation clause might read something like, even though buyer just submitted an offer for $400,000, buyer will increase his offer by $1,000 above any other bona fide offer up to a cap of $430,000. Let's talk about why I'm not a fan of escalation clauses. Among the reasons I'm not a fan of escalation clauses is that, one, if a buyer submits an escalation clause with a cap, like I just mentioned, the cap of $430,000, then the seller knows that the buyer is willing to go up to $430,000, and it might invite a counterproposal regardless of whether the seller has any other offers at all, whether the seller has other offers that approach $430,000. Identifying the cap might invite a counterproposal at $430,000. Buyers are thinking, some of you are thinking, okay, Jon, I get that point. So I will submit my escalation clause without a cap in it. Well, think about what that telegraphs to the seller. It either suggests that there's a reckless buyer, or that there's a buyer who's planning on using another contingency, some other contingency, like a financing contingency, like an inspection contingency, to get out of the contract if the escalation clause and the bidding associated with it drives the price up too richly for that buyer. What are other problems with escalation clauses? The buyer doesn't want to beat any offer by $1,000. The buyer only wants to beat other real offers, other bona fide offers, other arm's length offers by $1,000. Well, how does the buyer really know whether the other offers are arm's length offers or not? And if the buyer can know, the buyer would find out through some sort of verification process. Well, that verification process slows things down for a seller. And the terms like a bona fide offer or an arm's length offer are inherently mushy terms. If I'm a seller, I would be turned off by that verification process necessary to verify that something was a bona fide offer. I would be turned off by the uncertainty of whether the buyer and seller agreed about whether another offer is a bona fide offer. And if Jon Goodman is the seller, I would just want this buyer to submit the offer that the buyer wants to make at the buyer's highest and best figure. Another issue is, what does the buyer have to beat? Does the buyer have to beat the gross price of other offers or the net price of other offers? For example, there might be a buyer who submits an offer for $420,000 and asks the seller for $5,000 of seller concessions to that other buyer. Does the escalation clause have to beat the amount of $420,000, or does it have to beat the net offer of $415,000? If we get into that issue, what are we talking about? Net of what? Net of seller concessions, net of who's paying for the title insurance, net of transaction costs. Another issue about escalation clauses is, how do they interact with each other? In a lot of these situations, a listing broker, a seller, is receiving 5, 6, 8 offers, and if 80% of the offers have escalation clauses, how do they interact with each other? From the listing broker's side and the seller's perspective, what I want to do is encourage people to submit their highest and best offers. If buyers want to submit offers with escalation clauses, we don't want to discourage that. After all, they're telegraphing that they're willing to go higher than their offer. But what I would do as a seller is try and cull the multiple offers down to 2 or 3 that seemed like the most viable offers, the best buyers, the ones with the fewest contingencies, and then I would solicit highest and best offers from those 2 or 3 or 1 serious buyer. From the buyer's perspective, what's an alternative? Because I do know that escalation clauses are effective in getting the attention of some sellers. There's a way to do that outside the contract. Submit an offer at a generous price, above the list price, for example, but below the seller's bottom line. And then through the communication skills of the offering broker, maybe with the transmittal email, maybe by calling the listing broker, let them know your buyer is willing to go higher. Your buyer doesn't want to mess around. They doesn't want to jack the seller around with all the complications and weirdness of escalation clauses that I've just talked about. But if the seller has other offers that are higher, this listing broker, it's in that listing broker's best interest and the seller's best interest to get back to your buyer, because you have a buyer who will go higher and can actually close on the transaction. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all I want to say about escalation clauses this morning. As always, thank you for listening, and also be mindful that I am a lawyer in the state of Colorado. If you are working on real estate transactions outside the state of Colorado, consult a lawyer in your state who is licensed in your state. I'm not. And for everybody, we live in a complicated world. Be careful out there.